Hello. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about another feature of the English language, which is pervasive. You find it everywhere. You're using it all the time, sometimes even if you're not aware of it. And this feature is euphemism. And then connected with euphemism is also this topic of dirty words in English. I'll be talking about that a little bit as well. So I'll just jump right in and give you the definition of euphemism. Now, if you have the handout or the outline that goes along with this lecture, there's a link to it on the syllabus right next to euphemism. And at the top of the handout, you'll see the term euphemism. And here's the definition of it in the slide. So euphemism is a mild or less offensive word or phrase that replaces an offensive one. Notice that euphemism is actually a Greek word. It's made of the element eu, that means good or well, and the word theme, that means speech. So that euphemism is good speech. It's word or phrase that you use that's better, that's nicer than something else that might be more offensive and blunt. Notice that the outline tells you that originally the word euphemism was used especially to mean silence at a religious ritual, right? So if you're in a religious ritual, you would keep quiet. You would not say certain things that might be offensive or that might offend someone or just kind of break the mood of it. So that's kind of the origin of where euphemism comes from. But of course now the term euphemism, or even back then as well, the term or the idea of euphemism could be expanded to lots of different contexts where you kind of monitor your speech. You take care of the words that you use. And when you think about it, you do the same thing depending on the context you're in. Like right now, when I'm talking to you, I'm using certain language that's going to tend to be more formal, and I'm going to try not to be offensive, use offensive language. Whereas in other more relaxed, informal situations with your friends, then you may not have to use nearly as many euphemisms. Also, if you look at the outline again, notice that euphemism can sometimes be connected with pejoration, right? Because very often a word may take a negative turn, right? It may take on a negative meaning, and then that word needs to be avoided. That you need to replace that word with a euphemism. So this is something that these are processes that can occur in conjunction. And then notice also the outline indicates that euphemism obviously has a kind of social function or purpose, and often we could see it as having a good function, right? That when you use the right terms and right language, you're showing respect and tact and courtesy towards your fellow human beings. But then also there are other times when we might see euphemism in a more negative light, and maybe even having a kind of corrosive effect on society when euphemisms become a kind of dishonesty or deception, that is avoiding reality, right? Or avoiding the truth, right? You're telling yourself a bunch of stuff or using language where you're avoiding talking about the real kind of hard truths. And we see this especially, say, in political uses, right? That politicians often use and leaders use euphemisms, and they're avoiding telling the real truth. Right? Like when a political leader talks about collateral damage in some kind of military operation where, what collateral damage refers to, of course, is civilians being killed in their houses or at wedding rituals and things like that. But that term collateral damage sort of makes it seem as if it's not as bad as it is. And so again, we might think that that's a more kind of a negative side of euphemism. So in any case, there's some issues. There's some social issues to think about with euphemism that people have talked about. Now, the terms that we try to avoid, the terms that we don't like to use, we refer to as taboo terms, right? So that's the general term for all the words or phrases that we regard as offensive or unpleasant in some way, and so prohibited. They're taboo. And what happens with these taboo terms is we avoid them, or sometimes we deform them to some extent so that they don't seem so bad to us, right? Like instead of saying damn, we say darn, or we say shoot instead of the alternative to that, or we say oh phooey, right? Again, instead of the alternative, or we say golly instead of God, or gee whiz instead of Jesus, right? These are all deformations of words and terms if we said the direct the actual taboo word, then we would offend people or get in trouble. So that's what we mean by taboo terms. Now, among taboo terms, the most obvious taboo terms, of course, are swear words, obscenities, curse words, expletives, dirty words, right? There are all these different terms for them. And these are especially fascinating words because it seems like the words themselves are kind of unclean, right? They're words that they're filthy, right? They're dirty. They have something about them that you just want to avoid. Because notice it's not because of the subject matter of these words. That's not really why they are taboo, right? Because, for example, people talk about sex all the time. And of course, it is somewhat of a taboo topic, but people talk about it all the time, right? Daytime talk shows, they could be talking about sex. You have Dr. Ruth Westheimer, she's still around, who's a sex expert. And they can talk about it just as much as they want, but they can't use certain words in talking about it, right? They can't use the F word. And this is really the kind of the premise of this very famous classic comedy routine that George Carlin had called The 7 Words You Can't Say on Television, right? Because basically his whole kind of comic routine there is based on this kind of fascinating and difficult question about, why are these words? Why do we have to avoid these words? What's so special about them? Why are they so magical? Or why do they have this kind of dirt about them just in themselves? So this is a particular group then of taboo terms that the words by themselves are taboo. Now notice that these words, these swear words, right? These dirty words, they are almost all English words. They're not borrowed from Greek or Latin. They're words that have been around since the beginning of English, or for a long, long time, thousands of years, or at least hundreds of years, and they've been dirty for that amount of time too. Sometimes they may be felt to be less dirty than at other times, right? Things can change as far as how filthy a word is, right? Even things nowadays have changed so that there are certain words that are even used on television that weren't used, say, 20, 30 years ago. But nevertheless, they are these words that seem to have this kind of special status, and they, as I say, then they're English words. They're not Greek or Latin words. In fact, sometimes we might use a Greek word or a Latin word as a euphemism, right? So if you say defecate, right, this is a Latin word, and it's a way of talking about, well, a biological function, and but that's, I would say, as a euphemism, it's a little bit nicer, or at least less blunt and offensive way of referring to that biological biological function. Okay, so those are the especially powerful words that they're in a kind of a class by themselves. But notice that euphemism is far more general and pervasive than just swear words, right? In the area of swear words, there are all these general topics where we also kind of tend to use euphemisms. We use words and expressions that are a way of avoiding saying things directly. And our language is just full of these expressions. And if you just start paying attention and observing, you'll notice that you're using these yourselves, I'm sure. And if you look at the lecture outline, what I've given you is a list of different topics. And under each of these topics, there are lots of different phrases and expressions that we use that are euphemisms. So, for example, instead of saying someone's pregnant, you might say, she's with child, right? Or she is expecting, right? So these are nicer ways, whereas she's pregnant sounds a little bit more blunt. Now, of course, people always bring up the phrase like that she's knocked up. Now, I would not call that a euphemism. That's more like a vulgar metaphor, right? Because she's not literally knocked up, but it's this kind of vulgar physical metaphor used to describe pregnancy. It's not really a euphemism. If anything, it's the opposite. It's a kind of a more direct, blunt, kind of crude way of saying something. So that's one of the topics. Or think about death and burial. We don't want to say someone died, right? That's very kind of blunt. We say someone passed away. Someone is now departed, right? Or with burial, right? We don't talk about, when you go to a funeral home, you don't go to look at the corpse right, in a coffin, right? The body or the beloved one or the departed one is lying in the casket, right? These are nicer, more euphemistic expressions. Or with body parts and bodily functions. Well, I also already mentioned something like defecate, or when you say that someone's going to the bathroom, this is obviously a euphemism, right? Because, well, you're not going there to take a bath, right? You're not literally going there to, but it's a way of kind of avoiding saying something directly. And or similarly with age and socioeconomic level and disability, right? We don't talk about, instead of saying the old people, right? That sounds kind of harsh. We say the elderly, or we say senior citizens. And we often try to avoid saying the poor, right? The poor, again, might be kind of harsh. Instead, we say underprivileged, or for disability, right? You're not supposed, you don't use the word crippled, right? You say various things like disadvantaged. Even disabled now, I think, is not necessarily very so accepted. Now, instead, you say, you say disadvantaged. So one thing that can happen with words is sometimes you have a word that's used as a euphemism, but then that word pejorates and takes on a kind of negative cast to it, and then you have to replace it with another euphemism. That, I think, has happened with things like handicapped, disabled, disadvantaged. With race and ethnicity, of course, again, there's always this kind of delicacy about what terms to use. Kind of what are the right terms to use that won't be offensive, and we want to have the kind of the correct, the euphemistic terms. Where again, I think we could see this as definitely a kind of being respectful, wanting to be respectful towards other people, and not use terms that can be denigrating or offensive. With what we might call humble professions, right? So instead of saying janitor, you say, which itself is a euphemism. Janitor is a Latin word that just means doorman. But janitor, we often replace with custodian, right? Where custodian sounds a little bit nicer, I guess. And custodian is actually a Latin word that means guardian. So even the Latin word does have a kind of a little bit better meaning. And then, of course, probably we have the most euphemisms of all for intimate relations and sex. And again, I'm sure you can come up with lots and lots of examples. Just keep in mind that if you want to identify something as a euphemism, it's got to be something that is a nicer, milder way of saying it, right? So if you're having a kind of a steady sexual relation with someone, you could say, I'm seeing someone, right? Where obviously seeing someone is, you're not just looking, right? That's not literally what you mean. You're using it as a euphemism. So notice that sometimes these euphemisms may involve a metaphor or a metonym in some way, so that you're drawing on language from something else to describe to use instead of the more blunt expression, or maybe you're just focusing on one particular aspect, say something that's part of the topic or associated with it. So you're using a metonym, right? Like, I think if you're saying I'm seeing someone, well, of course, seeing them would be part of having a steady relationship that involves sex. It's associated with it, right? Because obviously you are looking at each other and seeing each other, but it's obviously just a little tiny part of it. And then the last thing on the handout is just this general topic of PC language, or politically correct language. Of course, this is an example of wanting to use euphemisms, right? You're wanting to decide on what the euphemistic, nice, good ways of speaking about people in ways that you won't offend them. So PC language is also connected to this general topic. So in any case, I hope all of that's clear. And this is, again, something that I hope you yourselves will watch for. And we may then also, as I've kind of mentioned already, we may find ways in which Greek and Latin words, or Greek and Latin-based words, are used as euphemisms. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.